Good day to everyone. We will now discuss about consequentialism. This is the flow of our discussion. We'll begin by defining what is consequentialism. Then we will see the different variations or forms of consequentialism, which will vary from one author to another author. And we'll also try to look at the pros and cons of consequentialism, its positive effect, and the downside of this moral theory. Here are the references that we'll be using. Uh, I put it in the beginning because it's important to note that one author may vary his perspective to the other author. Some of the ideas of one author, particular author, is not found in the other author. They also differ and they may also complement. So the books that we'll be using are the books of Articulo and Florendo, Babor, Castillo, Montemayor, and Synod Armstrong. Now we go to the definition. Consequentialism by its name suggests it is simply the view that normative properties depend only on the consequences. Consequentialism is about the moral rightness of acts, which holds that whether an act is morally right depends only on the consequences of that act. The worth of an action should be judged according to the result, the product, the end, what works, what is practical. It brackets what is intrinsically moral act because it only looks at the consequences. Therefore, good consequences is equal to good actions, and bad consequences is equal to bad action. Here we have example cases of consequentialism. Keeping in mind the basic precept of consequentialism that an act is good if it produces pleasure, happiness, or good result, we can have these example cases to help us determine if an act is ethical or unethical based on the consequentialism principle. However, these examples are just general examples of consequentialism since there are still other forms of or variations of it. Number one, with the rule if the end of an act promotes unhappiness, even if it has intended to promote the greatest happiness, the act can be considered morally wrong. So, with this case, the case of the killer milk, a milk company has a genuine commitment not just for sales, but to social services like feeding programs and charities. They have their charity work to ATAs of Mount Paringa. Days after the feeding program, many ATAs died before they were brought to the hospital. The cause of death was later found severe lactose intolerance and allergies caused by the company's milk. In this case, it is undeniable that the act intended to promote the happiness of many people, but its consequence has resulted in the contrary, that is, in the suffering and death of many. Since the act failed to observe the principle of consequentialism, regardless of the nobility of its purpose, the act is unethical. Second example with this rule, if the end of an act has promoted the greatest amount of happiness of the greatest number of people, whatever means the act employs is morally justified. So here we have the case of Dr. Robin Hood. Dr. Robin Hood is a medical doctor who has a sincere conviction that everyone must, most especially the poor, must enjoy the benefits of good medical care. The conviction made him conduct medical mission to serve the poor who cannot afford the cost of medical care. One day he realized that he could no longer afford another medical mission. Left with little option, he makes one last desperate act. He steals from his hospital all the medical supplies he needed for his medical missions, since the hospital had a huge stockpile of medicines. and other medical items. He felt his act is justified because he did not do it for his personal ends but for the benefits of poor people. Under the consequentialism principle, the act of Dr. Robin Hood is morally good, even if the act employs an unethical means, which is stealing. The means is morally justifiable because it is an instrument used by the act to achieve the utilitarian end of promoting the happiness of greatest number of people, that is, the happiness of the poor mass, who benefit from the medical missions. Hospital patients who would later need the medical items are not necessarily denied by the act because, as indicated by the case, the hospital had sufficient supplies of medicine. We have the third case here with a rule: if an act unintentionally produces the greatest amount of happiness, the act is still morally good. So we have the case of a prank caller. Mr. Juan is an employee of a respectable company. When he feels bored on the job, which is often the idea of making prank calls becomes irresistible. One afternoon, he amused himself by calling a nearby police station and reporting an imaginary bank robbery in progress. The joke sounded too real, a case of bank robbery not far from where he worked. The police chief, fully convinced of the authenticity of the report, immediately dispatched the police officers to respond to the crime. A day after, Mr. Juan was shocked when he heard a report about a bank robbery, a true bank robbery foiled by an anonymous caller. The time the call was made and the place of the crime proved that his prank call successfully foiled a bank robbery, which led to the arrest of a notorious group of bank robbers. Without question, using the office telephones for personal and unnecessary purposes is unethical. The intention of the act is malicious, also including the lying. But in the particular case, the act, even if unethical, can be considered morally good since it has produced an intentional consequence that satisfies the consequential principle. This rule also covers cases where moral acts result in consequences contrary to the intention of the agent. For example, in the cases where the act of the agent intends only to benefit himself or only the few but has unintentionally benefited the many, the act is still considered to be morally good. Here are the forms and variations of consequentialism. I use forms and variations, but actually some of these crisscross with one another. They mean either the same or somehow related. So the way I put it is that these are the keywords that we will always hear when we see the different views of consequentialism. So we have the hedonism, and then we have egoism or egoistic hedonism. Some authors would use them the same. And then we have psychological hedonism, physical pleasure and mental pleasure. We need to know them in order to distinguish what particular consequentialism is discussed. Then the individual or egoistic utilitarianism, or simply egoism, and social or altruistic utilitarianism, or simply altruism. Then the utilitarianism with its act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. I know it's not yet making sense at this moment, but just bear with it, and anyhow we will run through it in the discussion. Those keywords, as the way I put it, because they are found from one author to another author, but the way I sum them up, the hedonism will have same definition or same connotation with egoism or egoistic hedonism, or the psychological hedonism, or in terms of physical pleasure, or the individual or egoistic utilitarianism, or simply egoism. While the utilitarianism, these are the words under it, the act utilitarianism, the rule utilitarianism, the mental pleasure, the social or altruistic utilitarianism, or simply altruism.